As we come on the air, we are live in Brussels for President Biden's first NATO summit, but the focus is on his next stop with 48 hours to go before the president sits down face to face with Vladimir Putin. And before he does, we did. Our own Keir Simmons here live with a brand new piece of that NBC Worldwide exclusive you will only see on this show. President Putin getting testy when pressed on Russian aggression towards Ukraine.
Will you commit now not to send any further Russian troops into Ukrainian sovereign territory?
We're to hear what Putin has to say about that. I'm Hallie Jackson in Washington as we start this busy Monday morning with NBC News senior international correspondent Keir Simmons live in Moscow with more of his exclusive interview. We're also joined by White House correspondent Mike Memoli traveling with President Biden in Brussels. Keir, good morning to you. And boy, this was a wide-ranging interview with President Putin, significant on a number of fronts, including on this question that you asked him about Ukraine.
That's right, Hallie, and what we were trying to do is understand what President Putin's strategy is in relation to Ukraine. Maybe it'll help for me to describe a Putin strategy, which is to attack, negotiate, so arrest Americans here in Russia, then try and negotiate a prisoner swap, launch cyber attacks, and then try and negotiate a cyber truce. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, what he appears to be doing is to threaten and negotiate, put troops on the border, and then say, well, I want to talk about NATO. Another thing you're going to hear him do in this piece of sound is go back to history, to resentment. So he'll talk about what is said to have been a negotiation between President Bush and President Gorbachev, where Bush promised not to expand NATO. The issue there, and I had to fact check him on this, is that that agreement was never written down. Take a listen. In the case of neighbouring Ukraine, earlier this year, the European Union said you had more than 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. Was that an attempt to get Washington's attention?
Look, first, Ukraine itself constantly, and I think is still doing that, it kept bringing personnel and military equipment to the conflict area in the southeast of Ukraine, Donbass. That's one. Two is that we conducted exercises in our territory, and not just in the south of the Russian Federation, but also in the Far East and in the North and in the Arctic. Simultaneously, military exercises were being held in different parts of the Russian Federation. At the very same time, the U.S. was conducting military exercises in Alaska. Do you know anything about it? Probably not. But I'll tell you that I do know. And that is in direct proximity to our borders. But that's in your territory, on your land. We didn't even pay attention to it. What is happening now? Now, at our southern borders, there is a war game, Defender Europe. 40,000 personnel, 15,000 units of military equipment. Part of them have been airlifted from the U.S. continent directly to our borders. Did we airlift any of our military technology to the U.S. borders? No, we did not.
Many of those,
why are you worried?
Many of those exercises are a response to your actions, Mr. President. Do you worry that your opposition to NATO has actually strengthened it? For 6 years, NATO has spent more on defence.
That's some defense. Some defense. During the USSR era, Gorbachev, who is still, thank God, with us, you can ask him, got a promise, a verbal promise. However, it was a promise that there would be NATO expansion to the east. Where are those promises? 2 waves of expansion.
Where is that written down? Where is that promise written down?
Right. Well done. Well done. Correct. You've got a point. Got you good. Well, congratulations. Of course, everything should be sealed and written on paper. But what was the point of expanding NATO to the east and bringing this infrastructure to our borders? And all of this before saying that we're the ones who have been acting aggressively? Why? On what basis? Did Russia, after the USSR collapsed, present any threat to the United States or European countries? We voluntarily withdrew our troops from Eastern Europe, leaving them just on empty land. Our people there, military personnel, lived there for decades in what was not normal conditions, including their children. We went to tremendous expenses. And what did we get in response? We got in response infrastructure next to our borders. And now you're saying that we're threatening to somebody. We're conducting war games on a regular basis, including sometimes surprise military exercises. Why should it worry the NATO partners? I just don't understand this.
Will you commit now not to send any further Russian troops into Ukrainian sovereign territory?
Look, did we say that we were planning to send our armed formations anywhere? We conducted war games in our territory. How can this not be clear? I'm saying it again because I want your audience to hear it. I want your listeners to hear it, both on the screens of their television sets and on the internet. We conducted military exercises in our territory. Imagine if we sent our troops into direct proximity to your borders. What would have been your response? We didn't do that. We did it in our territory. You conducted war games in Alaska. God bless you. But you had crossed an ocean, brought thousands of personnel and thousands of units of military equipment close to our borders, and yet you believe that we're acting aggressively, and somehow you're not. Just look at that. Pot calling the kettle black.
And of course, President Biden meeting with NATO today as the Secretary General of NATO, describing this morning it as a pivotal moment for the alliance. Hallie, I think one of the big questions for NATO, now that it does include Turkey and many countries in Eastern Europe, is whether it can stand together in the face of President Putin's threats. Hallie?
Right, the idea of the united front against Russian aggression, Keir. An extraordinary piece of that interview, Keir, with the sarcastic applause for you from President Putin. Stand by for 1 second, because Mike Memoli, let me bring you in here, because this is obviously going to come up, this issue of what Russia is doing with Ukraine on Wednesday when you see this summit in Geneva, right? I think that is more than safe to say.
Absolutely, Hallie. Now, the other day when I asked the First Lady if her husband was prepared for this sit-down with President Putin, she said he was over-prepared. But, of course, he's been using this entire trip to continue to prepare for Wednesday's face-to-face sit-down. And I can tell you firsthand from talking to White House officials, part of that preparation is watching Keir's fantastic interview. They've been eager for the bits that we've been rolling out all throughout the day. Now, part of this summit here, of course, NATO, is a very full agenda. They're talking about, yes, Russia. They're talking about China. They talk about the future of Afghanistan. But what the president has been doing, both in the UK during the G7 summit and today, as he's sitting down with a larger circle of leaders at the NATO summit, is talking to his counterparts to, in some cases, find out if there's a message they want him to relay as part of his face-to-face meeting, but also to get their perspectives on how to approach this conversation. And just earlier this morning, Biden had a separate discussion with the leaders of several Baltic states. Of course, the Baltics on Russia's border, very much heightened concern over his continued aggression against the West. And so the White House very carefully approaching this summit, very wary and looking for clues from the president. You could tell yesterday when the president answered questions from our colleague Peter Alexander that he's been mindful of what the president is saying, agreeing with Putin that relations are now at an all-time low. Now, not just Russia, though, of course, on the agenda. We know just in the next hour, the president's going to be sitting down for itself what would be a fascinating face-to-face conversation with President Erdogan of Turkey. We'll be hearing from the president later today in a news conference, Hallie.
And you'll be watching it right here on MSNBC Reports. Keir, you heard Mike's reporting there that even White House officials, just like our viewers, are eager to be seeing what else President Putin told you. I know next hour you're going to have a little bit more from that discussion. Tell us about it.
That's right, Hallie. Well, what President Putin consistently does in this interview, and it's an interesting study of the Russian president's psychology, if you like, is that when I ask him about Russia, he brings the conversation back to America again and again, despite the fact, of course, that he constantly says that countries shouldn't intervene in other countries' domestic affairs. And I do challenge him on that. In the next piece of sound we're going to play in the next hour, he brings the conversation back to the Black Lives Matter movement and begins to talk about that. You're going to hear what he says about that and why he brings that issue up in that piece of sound in the next hour, Honey.
Keir Simmons, making news from Moscow around the world. Thank you so much for bringing us that interview. We'll be looking for more of your reporting throughout the day. Mike Memoli, thank you. We are going to have this, as we said, right here on MSNBC Reports, on NBC Nightly News, on NBCnews.com. Later in this show, we're going to take a closer look at other news that President Putin made with Keir, specifically on the issue of a potential prisoner exchange. You're going to hear from the families of 2 U.S. citizens being held overseas. That's coming up. But for now, for live reaction from Ukraine on what we just saw unfold here on this show, I'm joined by a former advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky, Igor Novikov. Mr. Novikov, Igor, good morning. Thank you for being with us.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Let me start with your reaction overall to what we just heard from President Putin about Ukraine.
Well, judging from our experience, I mean, I'm talking from Kiev now, and it's year 8 of a major conflict with Russia. We have to deal with Russian aggression and with a hybrid warfare on a daily basis. I would say that President Putin, from what we see, doesn't seek to resolve conflicts. He seems to want to prolong all the conflicts because they provide him with opportunities. So I wouldn't take everything he says at face value, let's put it this way. Everyone here in Ukraine is nervous and concerned because there's been mixed messaging coming from the U.S. I mean, the Nord Stream 2 sanctions have confused a lot of pro-Westerners here in Ukraine. So we want this summit to happen and want to know what's next.
There was a very interesting moment in that interview, Igor, and I'm sure you picked up on it as well, when Keir, our colleague here at NBC, point blank asked Vladimir Putin if he would commit to not send any more troops into Ukrainian sovereign territory. I'm sure you also noticed that President Putin didn't directly answer, but pivoted and turned the question back on Keir. Does that concern you?
Of course it does, because I mean, look at the history of Russian aggression. I mean, Moldova is entering year 30 of Transnistria, the Republic of Transnistria. Georgia has been fighting it since 2008. We were in year 8 of Russian aggression, so I wouldn't take it at face value. I think President Putin is really comfortable with lying, during live interviews or not telling the truth. So yeah, obviously it is a bit scary when you're on the ground in Kiev and you hear that kind of reaction from him.
Let me look ahead about 48 hours from this moment with you right now and that summit between the 2 men in Geneva. The Washington Post laying out why your country, why Ukraine will be hanging on, as they say, every word, phrase, even the body language from this Biden-Putin summit, writing, expectations are low that talks will produce a breakthrough. Still, even the slightest shifts in policies have potential consequences for Ukraine, with President Zelensky saying last month, I'll be frank with you, I'm scared by this situation. So, Igor, what will you consider success coming out of this Putin-Biden meeting?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I think that the worst case scenario, President Biden will learn what we already know, that unfortunately, without any major pushback against President Putin's hybrid policies, without, appeasing him with the policy of appeasement, I mean, he's not going to get results. Russia needs to feel that pushback to react and stop its advances. So the worst case scenario, I mean, he'll make up his mind and realize that's the case. The best case scenario would be for President Biden to be really firm with President Putin and to draw some red lines for him that he's comfortable with.
Very quickly, I'm almost out of time here, but are you disappointed that President Biden did not first meet with President Zelensky in person? I know you know this, that was something that President Zelensky had lobbied for, in effect.
Well, given the history with the U.S. over the last 2 years, with what happened with President Trump, I think President Zelensky deserves that White House meeting, and I think President Zelensky would also benefit from the signal that would have sent. So had President Biden met with President Zelensky first, I mean, President Putin would get the message that, Ukraine matters. Now I think he would probably read the lack of that meeting as something the U.S. is comfortable with, as another red line that hasn't been drawn. So unfortunately, I mean, we have to deal with the situation, but I'd prefer for Zelensky to meet President Biden first.
Igor Novikov, former advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky. Thank you so much for being with us on the show, making news with us this morning here on a very busy Monday. We appreciate it. We've got some more breaking news in for us from the Supreme Court. Actually, I've just been handed this decision on a piece of rare bipartisan legislation from the Trump administration. It's the First Step Act. I want to bring in Justice correspondent Pete Williams, MSNBC chief legal correspondent Ari Melber, MSNBC legal contributor Melissa Murray as well. And Pete, let me start with you. This is one of the handful of decisions that we have been watching closely for a decision on today. What is the court? Tell us what's at stake here and what the court is saying.
Well, what's at stake was whether people who possessed a small amount of cocaine and were sentenced back when the disparity was so high that you got a much higher sentence for possessing small amounts of crack cocaine than you did powder. It was a 100-to-1 disparity. Whether you could take advantage of a revision in the law that lowered that disparity, potentially reducing your sentence under the First Step Act, it's rare bipartisan agreement between the Trump administration and Democrats in Congress that allowed people already in prison to go back and try to get their sentences reduced. And today the Supreme Court said, sorry, they cannot. So this involved a Florida man who was possessed about 4 grams of cocaine, and which would be about the weight of 4 paper clips. But he was sentenced as though he possessed nearly a pound of powder cocaine. And he wanted to go back and seek a reduction under this law. It was pretty apparent during the oral argument that the Supreme Court was sympathetic to his plight and that of hundreds of others in prison under these same circumstances. But they said, sorry, the way the law is worded, no matter what the people in Congress and the administration intended it to say, it doesn't say that. It doesn't apply to people like him. So they are out of luck. And the decision today was unanimous.
Melissa, what do you read into that, the fact that this decision was unanimous? And what are the implications of that sort of from the real world perspective?
So the fact that this was the last case of the term that was unanimous suggests that the court really didn't spend a lot of time hashing this out. I mean, they were pretty clear in oral argument about where the law was, although they were sympathetic to the defendant. The plain text of the statute said that this would not count for something that could be reduced. And so I think what we see here is the triumph of a kind of mode of statutory interpretation, the way that the court reads statutes, that is called textualism. We saw this last term in Bostock, where the court read Title VII to include sexual orientation discrimination because of its plain language. And here again, the plain language of the statute is ascendant.
Is there going to be something, Melissa, that Congress will need to or will want to take up after this decision, in your view?
So there's definitely an invitation from the court to Congress to take this up and to correct what might be an error in drafting or an oversight in drafting. And that happens pretty regularly between the court and Congress, a kind of interbranch dialogue. Whether Congress chooses to take that up really depends on the mood of Congress and, of course, whether there is bipartisan support to actually make the changes.
Ari, there's another piece of news coming out of the Supreme Court this morning as it relates to affirmative action. This is a big one, right, with the question in front of the court whether they're going to hear this case, this headline-making case from Harvard or not. And this morning, it sounds like they basically said, we want more information from the Biden administration. What's going on here?
Exactly. They've invited the Biden DOJ through the Solicitor General's office to weigh in. And the case we were just discussing also had new input from a new administration, which happens. This is an area where sometimes the lawyers at the DOJ will represent the position of the United States government, a.k.a. whoever runs the White House. And so here we're seeing the court both buy time, if you want to look at it that way, but also just solicit where does the Biden administration stand? And that's a big case because we've had so many discussions about diversity and ways to expand diversity in elite institutions and in American life. This is one where some petitioners, some people had argued that perhaps the way that Harvard is doing affirmative action to bring in some underrepresented groups might operate to actually, they argue, discriminate against Asian American students. And so it's pitting different groups against each other. We won't learn more because the DOJ is going to have to weigh in further.
Hey,
so,
Hallie,
Pete, go ahead. Yes.
My view on this is that I agree completely with Ari. I would just say one other thing. I don't think they really care what the Biden administration thinks about affirmative action. I think this is strictly a delaying tactic. Remember, we've already got abortion next term. We've got gun rights. I think this is the conservatives on the court, or at least enough of them saying, you know, enough blockbusters, let's put this off. Because at this point now, the earliest the court's going to hear from the Solicitor General is, you know, late this year, well into the start of the next term. I think this is strictly a delaying tactic. I don't think they care what the Biden administration thinks about affirmative action.
Well, this was my question, Pete, was kind of on the timeline piece of this. So does that mean that any potential decision on this would come not even next term, but the term after? And I know that's a real layperson question, but forgive me.
No, I think that's quite likely, and I think that's the reason why they did this. Can't be sure, but that sure seems like what it is.
Melissa, final thoughts to you on this.
Again, this is a big case, but it's going to be a barn burner of a term next term. And I think Pete's exactly right. They're trying to kick this can down the line. They may take it up next year, but again, it'll be late in the term and possibly we're not going to hear about what's going to happen until well into the middle of October term 2021. So I think this one's off the table for a while.
Real quick, Pete, when's the next day we're going to get decisions from SCOTUS? Thursday or next Monday?
Thursday.
All right. Pete Williams, Ari Melbourne, Melissa Murray. We will see you all in just 3 days from now, I'm sure, the same lineup. Thank you all for being with us as we break this developing news here on MSNBC Reports. Coming up next, we are just 2 days away from that high-stakes summit, as we've been talking about, between Presidents Putin and Biden. So coming up on the show, the dilemma facing the commander-in-chief when it comes to a possible prisoner swap with Moscow and the very personal plea from one of the families affected. Don't miss that. Coming up next. Ahead of Wednesday's high-profile summit between Presidents Biden and Putin, there is maybe some new hope this morning for the families of two Americans who've been imprisoned in Russia for more than 2 years. Here's the parents of one of those.
We're very happy to hear that President Putin is open to a prisoner exchange, and we hope that that's something that happens very soon because Trevor and Paul Whelan both have been there long enough, considering that they're innocent of the files of the charges against them. So,
and we don't care how he comes home.
Yeah.
If they want to exchange Trevor for some criminals that were, low-level criminals or whatever,
we're fine with that.
But a potential prisoner swap brings up a lot of pretty complicated questions for President Biden, right? So, for example, the U.S. believes these men were wrongly imprisoned in the first place. So why agree to a swap rather than demand their release? And importantly, can you really trust Vladimir Putin to follow through? With both sides agreeing the U.S.-Russian relationship is at its lowest point in years, Russian President Vladimir Putin this morning opening the door to a possible prisoner exchange. In that exclusive interview with NBC's Keir Simmons.
Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed, they are two former Marines. Trevor Reed is suffering from COVID in prison. Why don't you release them ahead of the summit? Wouldn't that show goodwill?
I know that we have certain U.S. citizens who are in prison, have been convicted, but if one considers the number of Russian Federation citizens who are in U.S. prisons, then these numbers don't even compare. Your guy, the Marine, he's just a drunk and a troublemaker. As they say here, he got himself based on vodka and started a fight. Among other things, he hit a cop.
So his family will find that incredibly distressing to hear you talk about him that way.
There is nothing offensive about it. He got drunk on vodka and started a fight.
And on the prisoner swap question, is that something that you would consider? Are you looking to negotiate? You're meeting with the president.
Yes, of course.
Reed, a Texas student, accused of assaulting a Moscow police officer after a night of drinking in 2019. He said he doesn't remember what happened that night and denied the charges before being sentenced to 9 years in Russian prison last year.
I have no idea what their motives would be, but this is clearly political.
U.S. officials have called the evidence against Reed preposterous. Reed was diagnosed with COVID last month, according to the U.S. Embassy, which says Russia is ignoring their demands for updates and phone calls. Paul Whelan is also imprisoned in Russia after traveling there for a wedding, accused of being a spy, which he denies. His brother tells NBC News he has mixed feelings about a potential prisoner exchange.
He is innocent. He was wrongly accused. We would rather see the door just open and him come out rather than some sort of negotiated release of Russian convicts.
Still, Whelan's attorney telling Reuters in February he was hopeful about negotiations, saying, quote, I think the American side has begun initiating talks, specifically under Biden.
It could also be something of a gimmick from Putin. You never know with him until you see the details.
I'm joined now by former Congresswoman Jane Harman, former director and president of the Woodrow Wilson Center. She's author of Insanity Defense, Why Our Failure to Confront National Security Problems makes us less safe. Congresswoman, good morning, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Holly.
Let me start with one more thing that Trevor Reed's dad told the Today Show this morning as it relates to this idea of a potential prisoner swap. Watch.
Of all the major issues between our countries, this prisoner exchange is probably the easiest thing that they could do. And if they can accomplish anything in this summit, it would be this exchange.
To put it a different way, I talked with former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, who described it as a potential confidence builder, if you will. So is Mr. Reed right? Is a prisoner swap kind of a low-risk, high-reward proposition for the Biden administration?
Well, it depends what kind of prisoners are swapped for what kind of prisoners. In this case, it does seem easy to do, and it does seem like a confidence builder, I agree. And the offense of drinking too much vodka, Russian vodka is really powerful. Having once had too much of it myself, it seems to me, again, easy to do in a context, but we don't know what the context is. It would be wonderful if this meeting also comes up with some Russian declaration that it will crack down on these criminal syndicates who are doing ransomware attacks all over the world, except where the Cyrillic alphabet is used. What sense does that make? And the U.S. has sent a strong signal without talking about it, which is we have gotten into networks and we've rolled back a lot of the Bitcoin payments that Colonial Pipeline made, and we've been able to recapture a lot of their ransom payments. So as we're getting better, and so that means that the impact of these folks is going to reduce, and that's a great signal to send to Russia.
You're talking about these ransomware attacks, these cyber attacks. In that interview with Kier, you had President Putin reiterating his call. He says that the U.S. works with Russia to, eliminate these cyber attacks, something that the U.S. has really dismissed as very disingenuous, if you will. Do you agree? And what message does President Biden need to send to Putin as he is now at NATO talking about sort of the importance of showing a united front against Russia?
Well, Russia is outside the big conversations of this trip. Let's understand. They're not doing much, if anything, about curing COVID in the world. The U.S. is the prime contributor of free vaccine through COVAX and with help from others. They're not doing anything about climate that I'm aware of at all. And they're not confronting China. And these are things that are going to be the subject of conversation today. And I think that Biden comes in with a strong hand. Vladimir Putin comes in with a weak hand. He's very good at playing a weak hand. But I think in the end, he needs this summit to be successful far more than the U.S. does. And I congratulate the Biden team for underplaying what could come out of this. It's not the only important thing this week. Let's understand the G7 talks mattered. The manifesto mattered. The meeting with the Queen, the meeting with Boris Johnson, and today's meeting with NATO, I think are very important and shouldn't be overshadowed by one quite short meeting with Vladimir Putin.
It's an important point. Jane Harman, thank you so much for being with us and for your perspective this morning. We appreciate it. Coming up here on this show, the House of Representatives getting back today from a 3-week break with huge issues facing Democratic leaders. We've also got some new reporting on what Republicans plan to do about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar after her controversial comments on Israel. Could it really cost her a committee seat? We're live on the Hill with the latest on that and a whole lot more. But first, Israel woke up this morning to new leadership for the first time in 12 years. The country's longest-serving prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, now out of power. The new government consists of a broad group of his opponents, including the United Arab List, which is the first Arab party to ever join an Israeli governing coalition. Netanyahu's former protege, Naftali Bennett, will serve as prime minister for at least the next 2 years. We are back live here in Washington. Also back in Washington, Congress in town today after a 3-week break with some pretty big items on the agenda. But the first order of business might be more back and forth over that controversy around Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's comments criticizing Israel. House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy expected to, quote, go on offense, according to Punchbowl News, by bringing forward a motion that would strip her of her seat on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Other GOP members are leading a censure effort. But Democrats want to focus on those other big ticket items, and the next few months potentially will make clear just how much or how little the 117th Congress will be able to accomplish. infrastructure, investigations into January 6th, election reform, next year's budget, whether there's any shot at changing the filibuster rules, with killing it seemingly off the table for good. All of it shaping up to be a mid-year mess, as Politico puts it. NBC's Sahil Kapoor is on Capitol Hill. Also with us is investigative reporter for NBC's Washington station WRC, Scott MacFarlane, with more on some of the January 6 developments. Scott, stand by for 1 second. Sahil, let me start with you on this reporting from Punchbowl about these GOP resolutions on Congresswoman Omar and what it means for Democrats. How realistic is it that anything's going to happen here?
Hallie, it looks like there will be a series of competing resolutions in the House. NBC News has not confirmed Kevin McCarthy's plans, but there is a group of other Republicans that are crafting a resolution designed to censure Congresswoman Omar. There is also a Democrat, Brad Schneider, who is working on and plans to introduce a resolution to censure Marjorie Taylor Greene over comments she made comparing mask wearing to the Holocaust. Now, all of this comes as Democrats have much bigger fish to fry on the governing front. The top of the agenda is infrastructure, where Democrats are locked in a debate amongst themselves about whether to continue trying to find 60 votes with Republican cooperation to pass a bill, or whether to simply go it alone, use their filibuster-proof option. There's a major election reform bill known as the For the People Act that is hitting the Senate floor sometime next week. Democrats are struggling to get the votes to pass that. They have to figure out how to investigate the January 6th attack after Senate Republicans filibustered an independent commission to do that. So there's a lot on the plate of Democrats, and this comes at a crucial stretch, as you point out, Hallie, because in the coming weeks, they're going to have to sort through these things before the August recess, and after the August recess, the midterm jitters tend to creep in, and lawmakers become much more wary of doing things. So infrastructure is President Biden's top agenda item. When he comes back, he'll certainly be checking back in to where things are on Capitol Hill. And so far, at this moment, Democrats are learning a difficult lesson, which is that to get 60 votes in the Senate, pretty much anything needs to have the stamp of approval of Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader. Democrats have found that they can pick off small numbers of Republicans, 2, 3, 4, up to 6 or 7, but getting 10 of them ends up always needing to get the Kentucky Republican support. And that has proven quite a challenge because he is mobilizing to stymie President Biden's biggest ambitions, Hallie.
That's for sure. Sahil Kapoor, live on the Hill. Sahil, thank you. Scott, let me go to you here because Congress is still looking, as Sahil alluded to, at the next steps for investigating what happened on January 6th. But in the court system, we've got several developments today. And I know you're watching for what you describe as sort of the case to keep an eye on this week. Explain that.
Yeah, the House Oversight Committee meets tomorrow to talk about January 6th. Between now and then, Hallie, I expect some movement in the case of the accused 3 percenters, another one of those far-right groups accused of being part of January 6th. Before the weekend began, the Justice Department announced a sweeping new case against these accused 3 percenters, accusing them of conspiracy, of some of the earliest planning of January 6th, as early as November, and potential violence against those who would accept the 2020 elections. A few hours ago, the feds asked to keep one of those accused 3 percenters in jail until further hearings. I expect more of that. There are several Californians charged. That's where my focus is. But one other note, Hallie. In about 3 hours, 2 people from Virginia will have a plea agreement hearing. They are lower ranking in the charges, just unlawful entry, obstruction of proceedings. Big question is, will they be asked to cooperate with the feds in the investigation as part of their plea? If so, if that happens, Holly, that could be precedent setting and sweeping for these 500-plus defendants.
Scott MacFarlane, when will we know, by the way, whether that happens? Scott, what's the timing on that?
2 p.m. Eastern time, we'll be on top of it. We'll report back to you as soon as it comes in.
Scott MacFarlane from WRC, Sahil Kapoor, live for us on the Hill. Thanks to the both of you. New reporting this morning that the Justice Department secretly subpoenaed the phone records of this guy, former White House counsel Don McGahn and his wife. We're talking with one of the reporters who broke that story. Plus, the meeting that current Attorney General Merrick Garland is having today that could have a huge impact on the future of the free press. We're talking about that after the break. This is a breaking news to share with you, including news coming in just in the last 3 minutes during that last commercial break of a resignation at the Department of Justice, reportedly related to the uproar over some of the subpoena discussions that have been happening, the leak discussions that have been happening here. It comes as there's this meeting that might have big implications for the future of the free press on the Attorney General's schedule, with the New York Times reporting Merrick Garland will be meeting with leaders of the Times, the Washington Post, and CNN, with the expected focus, those newly revealed seizures of reporters' phone and email data by the Trump administration's Justice Department. That's triggering some big backlash, as you know, and a promise by President Biden to shift course, leading to questions about where the line would be drawn for what is or is not protected and how any new rules would be put in place, with congressional action needed to make any new protections harder to roll back. We're going to bring you updates on that meeting as we get them. And we should note that, again, in the last 3 minutes, there's a statement out from the Attorney General on subpoenas to members of Congress. I want to share with you a bit about what Attorney General Merrick Garland is saying, specifically that he believes that he has instructed his Deputy Attorney General to evaluate and strengthen the department's existing policies and procedures for obtaining records of the legislative branch. This comes, of course, after we learned just days ago that some members, at least 2 key Democrats, Trump critics, had their records subpoenaed by the then Trump Department of Justice. We're talking about Congressman Adam Schiff, Congressman Eric Swalwell. You see them on screen right now. You also see White House counsel Don McGahn with the New York Times reporting that McGahn's records were subpoenaed as well. Let me bring in Charlie Savage here, who, of course, covers the Justice Department for the New York Times. And Charlie, let me take this segment in a bit of a different direction, because there's a lot of news that has just broken in the last 5 minutes here. Let me start with this resignation over at the Justice Department that I believe NBC News has not confirmed, but that you at the New York Times have, right?
That's correct.
Tell us about it.
This is John Demers. He's the head of the Justice Department's National Security Division, and he's a holdover Trump-era official. He generally is seen as a kind of apolitical person, and the incoming Biden people asked him to stay on until they got their own Assistant Attorney General for National Security confirmed. And they have nominated Matt Olson for that position, but he's not confirmed yet. They thought originally that he would be confirmed by now. So there's a little bit of fuzziness here about he had thought he was going to be stepping down by the summer, and then because of the Olson thing was delayed, he was staying on. And now abruptly he's going to be gone by the end of next week, apparently. This is relevant to all of this because the National Security Division would be overseeing investigations that included leak investigations and requests for subpoenas for reporters' information. And it's possible that he certainly would know about something that at that level of fraughtness, and he had the authority to approve it in the place of the Attorney General, and may have done that in the case of the New York Times phone record seizure.
Charlie, on this topic of subpoenas and the discussion around that, Merrick Garland and his Justice Department has come under pressure, frankly, from some members of Congress, including lawmakers who were on this show last week, who talked about wanting an investigation into how it was possible that the DOJ, under former President Trump, let's be clear, that happened before the Biden administration, basically forced Apple to hand over the records of some Democrats in Congress. We are now, as I read at the top of this segment, hearing from the Attorney General. And again, forgive us, we can't put up a graphic. This is literally unfolding as we speak, saying that he's directed that this matter be referred to the Inspector General, and saying that there will be an examination to look at the policies for obtaining records of members of Congress. How do you read this, and what are the implications of that, Charlie?
So it looks like the brouhaha over the seizure of reporter records that consumed the last couple of weeks has obviously expanded now into a very similar uproar, but also a lot of unanswered questions about just how intrusive or maybe not so intrusive this was. And they're handling it the same way. They're saying, let's have the Inspector General, who's independent of the Justice Department, his name is Michael Horowitz, take a look at this and write a report telling everyone exactly what happened. And even before we hear from that report, we're going to impose some new restrictions going forward. I imagine that will involve higher level supervision or something like that. These both reporter investigations and congressional investigations, that is, investigations that could affect the media or Congress, are already considered sensitive investigations, and there's already extra rules and requirements for them. So I guess they're going to ratchet those up even more. We aren't hearing him saying we're not going to investigate any crime that may have happened in Congress, including a leak, in the same way that he's saying that we're not going to seize reporters' information anymore. So that's a little bit vague about what this new restriction might be.
And all of this relates, of course, to, Charlie, the news that you were a part of breaking just within the last 24 hours or so, that the records of former White House counsel Don McGahn had also been subpoenaed, apparently, by the then Trump administration, basically. This is really creating some controversy here. Be clear, though, it is not inherently improper for the subpoena of records, whether they be for, reporters or members of Congress or the White House counsel or whatever, unless the motive behind it was not in good faith, right?
Well, certainly. And also just to flag one of the big questions here, you said this was the Trump Justice Department. Or, it's possible that the McGahn records were seized by the special counsel, by Robert Mueller, which technically would be the Justice Department, but it would be maybe misleading to think that Trump did it, people who are part of the Trump team. We just don't know. There's a huge amount of unanswered questions here, both in the congressional subpoena and in the McGahn subpoena. It is possible that this is as limited as they were looking at someone else. That other person had been in contact with a long list of phone numbers and email addresses, and they simply asked companies to identify who were behind those accounts, as opposed to getting into their private, communications traffic or metadata. But we don't know what was being investigated. We don't know why. Nevertheless, I think it's indisputably extraordinary that a sitting White House counsel had any information about him subpoenaed under a gag order and that he's only now found out about.
Charlie Savage, Charlie, thank you. And I should note for our viewers here, again, you are watching kind of the sausage being made as we speak here, because NBC News has now confirmed, Charlie, what the Times has confirmed and others, which is the departure of that Department of Justice official, Ken Delaney, reporting that, as you say, it had been something that was planned at least for some time.